You know that classic horror movie trope, right? You're the protagonist, you're terrified, the phone rings, you pick it up, and the police operator is like, get out of the house immediately.
Right, because the call is coming from inside the house.
Exactly. It is like the ultimate violation of your safe space. But I want you to imagine a slightly different version of that movie. Imagine the call is coming from inside the house, and you are standing on the front porch, literally begging for help.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But society on the outside is just, standing on your lawn, pointing fingers, and blaming you for the phone ringing in the first place.
That's a really chilling visual.
Right. And today, we're taking you into a reality that completely ignores the narrative we're usually fed. We're bringing you a custom-tailored deep dive into this really brilliant, honestly kind of startling piece from Psychology Today.
Yeah, by Winifred Rule.
Yes, titled, Are Parents the First Victims of a Psychopath?
It's just a profound shift in perspective.
Yeah.
Because, if you consume true crime media or, read psychological thrillers, the focus is almost exclusively on the adult psychopath.
Always.
Right. The camera follows the adult who is manipulating or harming people out in the wider world, and their origin story or the environment they grew up in is usually just glossed over.
Or it's reduced to this cheap cinematic cliche like, oh, they had a dark childhood.
Exactly. But our mission today is to explore the actual clinical reality of those early years. We're going to examine not just the observable behaviors of these kids, but the systemic lack of support and the profound psychological toll placed on the very people who suffer their behavior first.
The parents.
The parents, yes.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really understand the reality taking place in these living rooms, we first have to look at what the research actually says about how and when these behaviors emerge.
Yeah, the timeline.
Because contrary to popular belief, psychopathy doesn't just suddenly switch on like a light bulb on someone's 18th birthday.
No, not at all.
We always assume the psychopath is this lone wolf, but they grew up in a family unit. And the science shows that the signs are there incredibly early.
The research consistently tracks the early emergence of these behaviors. Dr. Robert D. Hare, who is a highly renowned psychopathy researcher, has made it definitively clear that most psychopaths exhibit serious behavioral problems at a very early age.
So we're talking about toddlers here.
We are. It's a developmental trajectory. We're talking about observable, problematic behaviors in toddlers and young children.
Yeah.
And this is a massive point of friction. The medical community handles this in a very specific way.
How so?
Well, professionals basically refuse to use the word psychopath when diagnosing children.
Huh.
Instead, they rely on a much more sterile kind of medicalized phrase, which is callous-unemotional traits.
Callous-unemotional traits. Okay, I'm going to stop right there because we need to explain what that actually means mechanically.
Yeah.
What does a callous-unemotional trait look like in a child's brain compared to, say, a neurotypical child?
That is the crucial distinction to make. It really comes down to understanding the mechanics of empathy.
Right.
We generally use the word empathy as this broad catch-all, right?
Right.
But psychologically, there are two distinct types. You have affective empathy and cognitive empathy.
Okay.
So affective empathy is the physical, emotional sensation you feel when you see someone else in pain.
Like when you wince if you see someone stub their toe.
Exactly.
Mm.
If a neurotypical child pushes their sibling down and sees them cry, that child will often feel a pang of distress in their own chest. They literally feel a reflection of the pain.
Right. Okay.
Cognitive empathy, on the other hand, is merely the intellectual understanding of emotion. So a child with callous, unemotional traits might notice their sibling crying and intellectually realize, crying means they are sad and society expects an apology now.
But they don't actually feel anything.
They feel absolutely nothing in their chest. They possess the intellectual instruction manual for human emotion, but they completely lack the internal hardware to actually experience it.
Wow. So they learn very early on how to mimic the correct response without feeling the weight of the action.
Precisely.
That is deeply unsettling. But wait, if researchers like Mark Dadds at the University of New South Wales know that this temperament exists and is identifiable early on, which the article notes he admits is backed by quite strong research, why the refusal to label it what it is?
Well, it's a complicated...
If you know the kid has these traits, isn't shielding them from the psychopath label just a matter of clinical semantics? Honestly, it sounds a bit like clinical cowardice to me.
That's a strong word, but I get it.
You're protecting a hypothetical future while leaving the family totally defenseless in the present.
What's fascinating here is the intense ethical tightrope the clinical community is attempting to walk. On one hand, psychologists are terrified of the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Okay, meaning what?
If a doctor stamps a 6-year-old's medical chart with the word psychopath, they're effectively writing off that child's entire future.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
That singular word changes how teachers, pediatricians, and eventually the legal system will treat that child forever. It is an incredibly ruinous label. So clinicians use terms like callous-unemotional traits to intentionally leave the door open for the possibility of developmental change, or, to justify funding for targeted behavioral interventions without completely destroying the kid's reputation.
But by refusing to call a spade, aren't they basically gaslighting the
It
parents?
certainly feels that way to them, yeah.
Like, a mother comes into a clinic and says, my child is doing things that feel fundamentally devoid of empathy. They are manipulating us. They're acting with targeted malice. And the doctor replies, well, they just have some callous unemotional traits.
Right.
It completely downplays the severity of the household trauma. It tells the parent, whether intentionally or not, that they are, like, overreacting.
Precisely. The well-intentioned caution of the medical community inadvertently invalidates the terrifying daily reality these parents are actually enduring.
Which is so unfair.
It is. The parents leave those appointments feeling confused, isolated, and often convinced that they are somehow mismanaging what must just be, a difficult developmental phase.
Right.
And this clinical hesitation paves the way for the core crisis these families face, which is the societal assumption that bad kids only come from bad parents.
Right, because if the doctors won't publicly acknowledge the biological reality of this temperament, then the neighborhood certainly isn't going to.
Exactly.
When society sees a child acting with extreme callousness or showing zero remorse for violence, the immediate knee-jerk reaction from teachers, neighbors, other parents is, what on earth is going on behind closed doors in that house? They immediately put the parents on trial.
And that assumption unleashes just a devastating tidal wave of secondary trauma. Parents of these children face immense compounding turmoil.
Because it's not just the child's behavior anymore.
No. When a child's extreme actions trigger interventions by school authorities, social services, or law enforcement, it starts this agonizing spiral of diagnostic evaluations and investigations.
Yeah, the article points out that these investigations often pull in extended family and close friends.
It is a profound invasion of privacy. Wounds are ripped open. You're dealing with raw emotionality, public disgrace, humiliation. And if the child does something severe enough to make the local news, the entire family is mired in public shame.
While they are already the victims.
Right. And all the while, the parents are agonizing over the situation, asking themselves repeatedly, did we do this? Where did we go wrong?
But the historical data totally contradicts that self-blame, doesn't it? The pioneering mid-20th century expert on psychopathy, Dr. Hervey Cleckley, spent his career researching hundreds of psychopaths.
Yes, his work is foundational.
And his conclusion was definitive. He found absolutely no regular, demonstrable link to parenting. He noted that a massive percentage of his psychopathic patients actually came from backgrounds of happy development and excellent adjustment.
Exactly.
So the data says that a child can be raised in a warm, loving, completely well-adjusted home and still develop these traits.
That data is vital, yet society broadly ignores it. John Edens, who is a clinical psychologist at Texas A&M, provides a very sobering reality check in the article regarding how these families are treated compared to others.
Yeah.
He points out that a psychopathy diagnosis is entirely different from something like an autism diagnosis.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because I think that comparison highlights the massive disparity in how we treat struggling families.
Definitely.
Over the last couple of decades, society has built a pretty robust trigger structure for neurodivergent diagnoses. If a child with autism has a severe meltdown in a grocery store, society is slowly learning to recognize, oh, that's sensory overload.
Right. People are learning to offer the parents grace, support, empathy.
Exactly. There are support groups, resources, community understanding. But Edens makes the brutal point that no one is sympathetic to the mother of a psychopath.
Nobody. Even if the diagnosis is perfectly accurate and the parents have done absolutely everything right, it remains a socially ruinous diagnosis. The empathy extended to families dealing with neurodivergent challenges completely evaporates when the challenge is behavioral and lacks effective empathy.
It's like the parents are functioning as a human lightning rod.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
They're absorbing all of this incredibly destructive energy just to keep the rest of the house and the neighborhood from burning down. And instead of offering a fire extinguisher, the neighbors are standing on the sidewalk complaining about the noise from the thunder.
That is exactly what happens.
They are the victims of the child's behavior, and then they're victimized all over again by the jury of public opinion. They are put on trial for a crime they didn't commit, while the actual perpetrator is the child they are desperately trying to protect.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to look at the psychology behind why society acts this way.
Yeah, why are we like this?
You have to ask why people are so fiercely committed to the bad parenting myth. Why do we willfully ignore Dr. Cleckley's science that says some kids might simply be wired this way?
Why do you think that is?
It ultimately comes down to psychological self-defense for the general public.
Oh, interesting.
Believing that a child can simply be born with a fundamental lack of empathy. A child who will grow up to manipulate and destroy regardless of how much love, stability, and resources they are given, that is an inherently terrifying concept.
Because it breaks the social contract.
Yes.
We want to believe in a world of strict cause and effect. We want to believe that input equals output. Good parenting creates good kids. Bad parenting creates bad kids.
That illusion of control is essential for society to function without constant anxiety. If a child acts out in terrifying, incomprehensible ways, society essentially needs to believe the parents caused it.
To protect themselves.
Because if the parents caused it, then the rest of us are safe. We can tell ourselves, I am a good parent, I read the right books, I provide a loving home, therefore this nightmare will never happen to me.
Wow.
Scapegoating the parents isn't just about judgment, it is a coping mechanism for the public. It allows society to maintain the comforting illusion that we have total control over who our children become.
That is a staggering realization. We scapegoat these parents purely so we can sleep soundly at night.
Basically, yes.
But, to truly grasp the isolation you're describing, we really need to move out of clinical theory and look at the lived realities behind these closed doors. And the source material gives us two specific tales of household anguish that illustrate everything we've just discussed.
Yeah. Moving from the macro level of societal blame down to the micro level of daily survival for these families.
Right. So the first case comes from Dr. Hare's book, Without Conscience. It centers on a couple, Helen and Steve, who have fraternal twin daughters, Ariel and Alice. Right from the start, there is a stark contrast between the two girls. Ariel brings good news and typical parenting joys. Alice brings deep worry. Alice was unusually precocious, but it lacked the innocence of a typical toddler.
So they were seeing those traits very early.
Very early. By age 3 or 4, she was exhibiting those early markers we talked about. And there's one deeply unsettling incident detailed in the book that perfectly illustrates your point about cognitive versus affective empathy.
What happened?
The family had a small kitten, and the kitten was found strangled.
A classic, deeply concerning behavioral red flag often associated with the emergence of psychopathic traits.
Exactly. But it's the reaction of the two girls that is so telling. Ariel, the twin sister, was genuinely devastated. She felt that affective empathy. She was heartbroken. But Alice, her tears were clearly forced.
Wow.
She recognized that sadness was the required social response to a dead pet, so she simulated it. She used cognitive empathy to mimic the emotion she knew she was supposed to show.
And did it get worse as they got older?
Much worse. Intense battles ensued in the home. Ariel would try to defend herself, but Alice was relentless and aggressive. She would aggressively destroy her sister's belongings and, hunt her down emotionally. By the time Alice was 17, she had turned to drugs, prostitution, and theft. The source notes that she cost her parents $10,000 just in bail and treatment programs.
It's just unbelievable.
And that financial and emotional drain was just the beginning of their nightmare.
Well, look at the psychological aftermath for Helen and Steve. I mean, they knew other parents in their social circle who were undeniably careless, right? Parents who put far less effort into raising their children, whose kids still turned out perfectly normal.
Yeah, that must be infuriating.
Yet Helen and Steve blame themselves endlessly. The joy they should have experienced in raising Ariel, who was developing normally, was completely eclipsed by the overwhelming anxiety, the constant worry, and the financial and emotional bankruptcy caused by Alice's behavior.
And that leads right into the second case, which comes from a feature story in the New York Times Magazine. This focuses on a boy named Michael.
Okay. And what was his trajectory?
He was headstrong and defiant by the age of 3. But as he grew, this wasn't just typical toddler boundary testing. It morphed into violent rage.
So again, extremely early onset.
Yes. He evinced those callous, unemotional traits combined with a cunning manipulation that was far beyond his years. The situation escalated so severely that by the time he was just 9 years old, His parents, Anne and Miguel, had to send him to an 8-week diagnostic program.
9 years old. That is an incredibly young age to require such an intensive 8-week psychological intervention. It speaks volumes about the severity of the disruption in their home and how unmanageable Michael's behavior had become for his parents.
And at that program, the therapist informed Anne and Miguel that Michael was exhibiting psychopathic behavior. But here's the detail that jumps out. Anne and Miguel had 2 other sons.
Oh,
Yeah. And both of them exhibited absolutely zero of these qualities. They were perfectly typical empathetic boys. But raising Michael overshadowed everything else in the household and provided this incredibly vivid description of what her daily life is like. She said, "It's like being in the army, facing a barrage of fire every day. You have to steel yourself against the outbursts and the hate."
it's an environment of constant hypervigilance.
Hmm.
You are living with someone who is constantly probing your defenses for a weakness.
Right. So what does this all mean? Look at the sibling dynamic in both of these cases because there's a massive logical contradiction here.
How so?
You have Alice, who had a twin sister raised in the exact same home at the exact same time by the exact same parents.
Right?
You have Michael, who had 2 perfectly normal brothers. Doesn't that definitively prove Dr. Cleckley's point that parenting isn't the root cause? If the physical living evidence of their good parenting is literally sitting in the next bedroom, how in the world do these parents still fall into such deep spirals of self-blame?
It is a profound psychological paradox, honestly. But it makes perfect sense when you understand how the human brain processes failure and grief.
Okay, tell me more.
You would logically think the presence of normal siblings would exonerate the parents in their own minds. They should be able to look at the neurotypical children and say, see, we know how to raise good kids. This isn't our fault.
Right.
But in reality, the presence of those siblings often heightens the parent's agony.
Wait, really? Why? Because the contrast between the children highlights the failure with the troubled child.
Yes, and because of a concept we can call agency in grief.
Agency and grief.
When a parent has one thriving child and one deeply troubled child, their brain desperately searches for the variable. They refuse to accept that it's just a biological anomaly, because accepting that means they are entirely helpless.
Oh, I see.
Instead, they ask themselves these agonizing micro-level questions. Did I hold this one less? Was I more stressed during this particular pregnancy? Did I react poorly to a tantrum when they were 2 and permanently break their trust?
By blaming themselves, they are clinging to the idea that they have agency.
Exactly.
If they made a mistake, then theoretically they can fix the mistake.
Precisely. Self-blame implies control. Accepting that your child is fundamentally biologically incapable of empathy, that they are actively weaponizing your natural, unconditional love against you, that is a grief so profound that self-blame is actually a more tolerable alternative.
Wow, that's heavy.
A child with psychopathic traits learns very early how to exploit the parental bond. They know exactly which buttons to push, how to simulate affection when they want something, and how to inflict maximum emotional damage when they are thwarted.
Because they've studied you.
Right. The parent is dealing with a predator who shares their DNA, living in their own home. The normal siblings don't act as proof of good parenting. They act as a constant, heartbreaking reminder of the loving, reciprocal relationship the parents will never, ever be able to have with the troubled child.
That is an unbelievable level of emotional endurance to ask of anyone. It brings us back to Anne's description of facing a barrage of fire every day.
Yeah.
But in this scenario, the person firing at you is the child you deeply love, and the outside world is criticizing your parenting strategy instead of offering any kind of backup.
It's tragic.
Which brings us to the stark realization that the author, Winifred Rule, makes at the conclusion of her article. For all the literature we have, all the psychological thrillers, all the clinical studies dedicated to adult psychopaths.
And there are thousands of them.
Right. While there is some research exploring whether parenting impacts the development of psychopathy, there is absolutely zero research into the victimization of parents by psychopathic children. None.
None. It is a complete blind spot in our psychological and societal understanding. We have thousands of pages dedicated to understanding the mind of the troubled child, and virtually nothing dedicated to understanding or treating the complex trauma of the parents who were forced to survive them.
Winifred Rule states that this research is long overdue, and after walking through these realities, I mean, it's impossible to disagree. So for you listening, think about the journey we've taken today. We started by looking at the science, how early these callous, unemotional traits emerge, long before the criminal justice system ever gets involved.
Right.
We unpacked the clinical hesitation to use the label and how that hesitation, combined with society's need for the illusion of control, feeds the destructive myth that bad behavior is always the result of bad parenting.
A myth we desperately need to let go of.
Absolutely. And we looked at the lived realities, exploring the profound psychological paradoxes of families like Helen and Steve and Anne and Miguel, who are living on the front lines, draining their finances and their emotional reserves entirely without societal support.
This raises an important question, one that challenges the very foundation of how we handle troubled youth.
Yeah.
Our entire societal support system, the schools, the healthcare networks, the pediatricians, they all rely on parents being the primary caregivers. They assume the home is a place of refuge and that the parent is the built-in partner for treatment.
Right, that's the baseline assumption.
But what happens to the fabric of the family when the child's very disorder makes the parent their primary target? If our societal mandate is always to protect the child at all costs, who helps the helpers when they are under siege in their own homes?